The counterculture movement started in the early 1960s in the United States and the United Kingdom. The movement never actually ended. The only aspect that changed was that it was absorbed by the mainstream culture. It was a post-war generation as a result of baby boom that pushed the movement forward, especially young people who were frustrated with racism, gender issues, human sexuality, consumerism, violence, and the conservative nature of the society in general. They began to question the traditional values like family, patriotism, religion, monogamy, and hard work. New cultural forms emerged, and thus the movement can be seen a culture counter to mainstream American society. The adherents saw themselves as part of an alternative culture created to bring about revolutionary social change by welcoming sex, drugs, pop music, and pursuing alternative lifestyles. The counterculture movement experienced a boom with the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War in 1954. Many of the proponents of the movement disagreed and suffered with the war that would increasingly escalate. The American involvement in Vietnam directly opposed the ideals they had been setting forth, aiming at peace, love, and non-violence. Various young men that opposed the war and supported the movement were soon drafted to fight for their country themselves. Protests against drafting were epitomized by symbolic events such as the invasion of 2,500 Berkeley students into a drafting office in 1967, attempting to close it. The March Against Death in 1969, also opposing the war, consisted of about 40,000 people marching in front of the Pentagon, carrying placards with names of American soldiers that had been killed during the war. This opposition, however, gained national momentum when 4 students at Kent State University were shot by National Guard troops in a protest against war. Although the anti-war movement did not officially have any impact on American legislation, it definitely set pressure for presidents to remove troops from Vietnam. These very pressures were the ones that forced President Johnson to not run for re-election and President Nixon to opt for peace with honor. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, music was considered a vital driving force behind the counterculture movement. With musicians and bands such as Bob Dylan, the 13th Floor Elevators, and the Beach Boys, U.S. music spread not only throughout America, but had a global impact that was felt in many parts of the world. The lyrics centered on general dissatisfaction and included common topics such as homosexuality and drugs. It moreover united people to protest and bond over talks of freedom and rebellions against the system, or even pushing the rules of convention to their outer limits. Additionally, it gave children and young adults of the new generation born into the counterculture movement new sources of inspiration. As the movement progressed, counterculture music developed towards electronic, psychedelic variations of rock and included new genres such as rock and roll and garage rock. Considered one of the biggest developments to evolve out of the counterculture movement is the large-scale music festival, such as the annual Newport Folk Festival since 1959 or the 1969 Woodstock Festival. Although authorities attempted to halt the counterculture movement of the 1960s by restricting political gatherings and enforcing censorship, the movement ultimately collapsed on its own around 1973. Historians disagree as to why the movement lost momentum at the time, but 3 main reasons are suggested. The first reason is that the ideals that ignited the movement were either achieved by that time, such as the end of the Vietnam War, or became mainstream in society. The second reason is that the movement declined when notable counterculture figures died or settled. Although historians such as Jacqueline Hall argue that the civil rights movement within the counterculture movement did not suffer declension, for example, it did lose its collective character as contrasting organizations clashed over how to approach it. With these disagreements between leaders and organizations, ordinary citizens became increasingly accountable for the goals put forward by the counterculture movement. But since most of these goals were complex and long-term, for example, feminism, they were conserved as increasingly dispersed legacies of the movement. The third reason for the downfall of the movement is that the magic economy of the 1960s was replaced by the stagflation of the 1970s, which allowed Americans to enjoy less freedom outside of social conventions. The other legacies of the counterculture movement post-1973 are clearly perceived in the arts, in present struggles for civil rights, in alternative behavior, and in culture of peaceful protests.